So I was having a whole discussion with a couple people about editors and how generally most of us have been scammed one way or another by a for-hire editor on the internet, in the indie scene especially. And then I was also thinking about how, I kind of keep saying traditional publishers are not editing well either. And, well, what are indie writers to do exactly? Because how are you supposed to find yourself a good editor? Like, I can say it's all well and good for me to say, hey, you need to get yourself a real editor, but how? Because talking with these people, it was like scammed out of hundreds of dollars, sometimes thousands, for these editors to do not even good grammar, right? And yeah, it's one of these lessons that I think every indie author learns and has to learn the hard way, but they shouldn't. So let's get into it. What makes a good editor? So I have said that I don't care if you use AI for your grammar, but I highly recommend you don't. Let's just start there. You need to know enough grammar to be able to catch when your editor is crap. This was something that happened to me with my first editor. She did a chapter and she had a huge vendetta against commas. And while I can understand why she had that vendetta, it got to the point where she was removing commas that were actually very, very necessary. And I didn't know how to quite call her out on it, especially because I already paid her. And then there were a couple of other things, which I'll get into later in the video. But that was the big red flag for me of like, God, I don't think I can work with you if you're just going to take out every single one of my commas. And that's a big thing. Like, I'm just going to come out and say it. A really good writer is going to know enough grammar that you're not going to have issues with your book and you're not going to have too much of that going on, if that makes sense. Where most of the grammar should be you're typing very fast and you make a couple mistakes and things like, okay, all of us have word check on our computers. You click on the wrong word when you did your word check, right? And that's, the editor should be able to catch that fairly easily. They should also have a good grasp of grammar, obviously. But you, the writer, really, really need to, like, if you don't have it, brush up on your grammar. And I've said it before, like, just grab this. Just grab this and read it. It's short. It's super small. That big, okay? And the only thing that can get fairly tricky, I believe, for most people is things like commas and semicolons and things like that. And word to the rise, err on the side of not using the semicolons, err on the side of not using dashes unless you really, really know what you're doing, or you really need to emphasize something, obviously. And commas are, if you're questioning a comma, read it out loud and see if you naturally pause or not. That's usually the best rule of thumb with a comma. Okay? And this is something you should be testing your editor on immediately. So when you go to find an editor, before you give them any amount of money, give them something to edit and see how they do with the grammar. And by the way, if they refuse to do practice test edit, they're not worth working with, period. The harder thing to find is honestly I know there are professional words for it, I don't really care. It's basically the content editing. It's the person who can help you to understand the flow of the story and help you to solidify that and take out paragraphs that don't need to be there and sentences and whatever without changing your writing style. This is really important because this was the second mistake my first editor made, which was she had a way of wanting things to go, and her suggestions were not necessarily bad, but they were not my writing style, and she wasn't really acknowledging that. So I guess an example of this would be, I like to use very simple descriptions. I'm not very good at prose, so I try to keep my descriptors very simple, to the point, right? And so sometimes I just find myself saying like brown, green, red, right? And she was like, why don't you use a color? Like another name to really drive home. Yeah, except then, I don't know, it's not my style, right? It's just not my style. Simple as. And that's okay. Like, not everything has to be so flowery and descriptive, and like, you don't have to perfect your descriptions. That's a style choice. And I feel like she wasn't really quite understanding that about me. There were other things that were a little bit more concrete in that regard, but this was the easiest example to explain of just like, it's not my style to do that. I try to reserve very descriptive things for very specific purposes in my writing. And so when I inevitably had to drop her as an editor and picked up my new editor, one of the things that was very important to me was that he was not going to change my style, and he doesn't. He never tells me to change word choices unless I like messed up the vocab. And there is the, okay, the sentence structure doesn't make sense and we need to work on that. But otherwise, he doesn't tell me like, hey, use mauve instead of red. So with trying to find someone who can do this for you, who can help you with the content without changing things too drastically, you do have to kind of get a feel for it. And I'll be honest, it's gonna take a couple books before you get that rapport with that person to really, really get to dig deep. So like, my first book was edited, but not as great as it was because me and my editor did not have that rapport. The second book went a lot smoother because we had developed a working relationship with each other, and he knew my thought process and I knew his, and so we were arguing less, and he would make suggestions and I could say yes or no, and I could explain myself yes or no, and more often than not he was able to make suggestions that I would say yes to because he knew better and he knew me at that point. And so the working relationship was so much better and the book was better edited for it. So this one takes time, and this is just my overall suggestion, by the way. Your debut should probably be a standalone, to be honest. There's so many mistakes you're gonna make in your debut, and you don't want it to be part of a series where people have to read it to get to the other books, especially as you get better at writing and you start to see the problems with your debut. Just leave it as its own thing and hone your craft on it, and then start your series. That's my suggestion. Just find something you can do that's a one and done, doesn't really go anywhere, and then get into what you really, really want to be doing. My biggest suggestion is, if you can, is to try to vet someone in your own life to be your editor. Because first of all, it'll be easier to have that rapport with them off the bat if it's someone who knows you and you know them and they're familiar with what you're doing. Part of the problem with all these like internet wannabe editors is like, okay, I'm gonna say it, most of them are failed novelists. They want to be writers, they're not. They're also like, English lit, and that's not great either, because an English degree kind of tells you what to think and tells you how things need to be. the good editing is not going to be focused on that. Good editing is going to be focused on what you are providing, not what they think you need to be providing. So when I was discussing this with my editor, who by the way is not an English major, not a writer, he actually has a business degree. We were discussing how sometimes actually people who work in business might actually be really good editors because they're better at being objective. They write work emails all the time and they have to go over other people's work and be objective with it, not be like, oh, this is what I want it to be. No, this is what it is, and I have to make sure I'm not insulting someone in the company if we send out this email, right? Another one I would say is look for history majors, people who've done history, because they will have usually the writing abilities since they've done a lot of papers, but when you study history, you have to be very, very objective. And you have to put your biases aside to study history. Just some examples of what you could be looking for. The other thing, and this is harder and not necessarily mandatory, and this is something the editors themselves should be working on, is ideally you should be finding an editor who's really good at story tropes and really good at analyzing and thinking about how stories come together and how they work. Because the last point of editing is how does your story come together and how does it work? And so one of the biggest problems with writing today is that so many people are trying to make their plot happen at the expense of their characters, instead of letting the characters tell the story as it's naturally unfolding. And I'm sometimes guilty of this too, especially more in the past. I've gotten better at letting those feelings go and saying, okay, this isn't working as a plot because the characters are doing this and I just have to accept that they're doing this. Oh my God, characters, can you stop doing that? But, a good editor, if you're starting to get into those ruts and whatever, will have the knowledge of storytelling too. Not that they can tell stories, as a writer does, but more so they understand structure and how things move along and why plots happen the way they do, and they can talk with you through your plot to say, hey, if you keep doing that, it's not gonna work. Now, it's probably not mandatory because that's very complicated, and I think it's something that actually good editors learn over time themselves. It's something you learn when you're becoming a good editor, not something you're maybe innately, although some have innate ability to do it, not gonna lie. I do think some of the greatest critics out there have this innate ability, and that's why their criticism is so good, because they're objective, but they also understand why the story works on a deep, fundamental, this is how these tropes work, the hero's journey, etc., etc. And one semantics thing. Do not pay your editor up front. Like any good work job, they should be paid upon completion. And for those editors who say, but then the person can run away with it, first of all, you two should have a relationship at that point where it is not in their best interest to run away with your work. But two, you can withhold the final edited draft. It's the same with artists. You can withhold the final picture until you get your money. This whole idea of paying half, even paying half now, half later, the only reason we do that with contractors is because they have to order materials. You don't pay them for the job until the job is over. You pay them for the materials, and then you're paying them for the labor afterwards. There's almost no job where you get paid up front. I don't know where this concept came, but I have seen too many stories of people paying editors to do absolutely nothing. So I'm sorry, editors, it's on you. you messed up. Writers, do not pay your editors up front.